It can be hard to talk about being black in tech because there aren't often other black people in tech spaces, it feels. And the tech spaces that are specifically for black people tend to be, well, they develop a culture like other groups in other places. And we recognize that blackness doesn't make us a monolith, and also we have unique experiences depending on where we exist. There's an amount of context that I appreciate being able to talk about in multiple contexts. Ooh, how do I describe this? I appreciate having experienced spaces where I could discuss the intersectionality of identity. Also, growth, new goals, and environments have made it, well, our needs develop over time, and we maintain our networks however we can. Cheers. I guess if you're a software engineer, the point is to be on as many teams as possible at some point in your career and also not leave them on sour terms. There are some things that I can say about literacy and family systems. More on that with my career. Cheers. Something had happened before I was professionally active as a tech professional. That's kind of redundant. Before I was professionally active in technology, a whole bunch of smart people put all of their intelligence into creating some pretty addictive media. And also, as a society, we've needed to learn how to relate to where we want to put our attention. Not every medium is going to be for every audience, and we can develop new relationships with what we consume. Sometimes I want to talk about experiences I've had, and I feel frustrated when I recall them. A dimension of my job is to practice modern media, to practice producing the kind of content that people enjoy, and also reflect on how it feels to have conversations with people who discuss how media impacts them. So I make media and talk about it with people who consume it, and I also consume media and reflect on how that makes me feel and think about it and pace and go on walks and reflect throughout the week. I make a lot of videos. A few years ago, I lost my job a few times. The first time was in 2021. I reached a point with that job where I had a clear vision for where I wanted a language that I was developing to go. And I also described that poorly at work. While I was adjusting to where we were as a society and resources were young adult, the next job I focused more on advancing in my career, both in title and pay. I lost that job, and my manager recommended that I communicate to audiences with lower IQs, that I practice communicating with lower IQ audiences, which I didn't appreciate as advice at the time, but has been an approach. It helps me understand expectations. The next job I lost while I was getting screened for ADHD, which was especially frustrating because I understood there was a pattern I was trying to work with. I was trying to learn how to navigate better. Then I lost insurance and housing and relationships, and all of that was after experiencing the reasons why I'm sometimes slower than my competency. I've learned ways to accommodate for this, and I have spent a few years pouring into my community. For one, TikTok. For two, wherever I've lived. For three, broader parts of the internet, like more specifically in the pocket of popular social media and websites that are easy to self host and make accessible. The topic that I thought of when I started making this video was going live on TikTok and being muted by someone who doesn't want to consider any duration of time that I would have considered an experience akin to trauma or loss of agency or identity or anything like that, which happens to intersect with a lot of the ways that we traumatize each other often in conversation and interaction. And also, there's an amount of grace that we need to extend each other, or else we will not heal. Something my family ran into is I was in accelerated programs early, which meant I developed language and skills about developing language that were different than some of my peers. I was also in an environment that made it easy for me to skip a grade or skip part of a grade. So I did, which meant I was physically, developmentally a bit behind my peers when I was in the same grade as them. And this impacted the social contours of my interactions with peers in different ways that appeared similar on the surface to how my father navigated his upbringing. And also, there's a lot that my family didn't have language to talk about, and a lot that we didn't have healing to talk about at the time. Some things that I've forgotten because now they're just the fabric of how we exist. The reasons some topics are difficult to talk about in families aren't necessarily because they still have the wounding capacity. They're not necessarily going to carry the same charge of harm. Also, my parents split their roles by gender, which changed the ways and places and times that they were available throughout our lives. Now I can point to the ways that I've related to language development as just part of the way that I find the things connecting. How do I say this? Like Lego. Lego to me is a language, and there are other languages that we can learn when we play with toys. We can also draw and come up with our own languages. So, from my perspective, I understand that this is just a way that I relate to the world, though it has been difficult at times to navigate the plethora of reasons that my father and I would share different language, or rather, why we would have different language and not notice the reasons or have precise tools to identify and navigate them. Precision isn't always necessary, though there are some patterns of behavior. Is behavior the word that I want to use? Like when we go to the doctor, ideally they would have some precision that we don't have access to, either via their medical knowledge or via their medical environment. I think this video was a reflection on accelerated programs and gender dynamics with availability in the household and linguistic differences as developmental phases are, well, as a human progresses through developmental phases. I also wonder about how we relate to development through TikTok. I'm curious about TikTok as a synchronization method intergenerational, pardon, intergenerationally. Cheers. Design, software development, brand development, networking. Professionally, I've been a software engineer for 15 years. That's also around the time that I got started with design specifically, and I've been illustrating for as long as I could hold a pencil, for as long as I could hold a crayon. Your brand and your style can stand out. It can also be familiar. Cheers. I grew up around the belief that there was a set of beliefs that you needed to have, otherwise, you wouldn't be accepted into the kingdom of God. And the concept of the kingdom of God developed over years, while I also developed and had relationships with peers and family members and learned things in school and learned things in church, participated in extracurriculars, read books, drew, watched TV, listened to the radio, and eventually used the internet. An experience you don't need to have as a software engineer is to want to express an idea more clearly and do that well enough for a bit with something like PowerPoint, or I guess now Google Slides. But also want to do something a bit more expressive more consistently, so get into scripting and start to explore web development as a way to save some energy with consistent style. You don't need to, and if you do, then you might care about web development for the reasons that I did to start. Cheers. I make a lot of videos and I update my website pretty often, so I can point to my website and videos sporadically, and you can see which ones have more quality. I update my website so the quality will change over time, and you can ask a language model to crawl my website to summarize the contents. Presumably, my goal would be to update my website sporadically enough to reward, I guess, some meaningful dimension of ecological engagement. Though I also make a lot of videos, and TikTok, X, are produced across the platforms. I wondered what it meant to have a belief, and also what it meant for people to relate to God if we were made in God's image and some people were men and others weren't. Part of this also was me wondering what it meant to be a good son, and also why I had the relationship I did with my father. My belief was that if there was a limited number of things we needed to know in order to get into heaven, and the reasons that we knew those things was we learned them through being children in a context. Like, I grew up Christian, so that's what I learned, and the beliefs that I had stemmed from that. So, if that was the mechanic for getting into heaven, then it should be possible to learn enough to be prepared for the world after college, if not everyone goes to college. You can make it your job to make it easier to distribute kindness and also reflect on what that means. You can also reflect on how you would feel if someone said that was their job and what you would expect your relationship to mean if that's the way they approach your relationship. Software engineering exists as a career, which is an option for careers. You don't need a degree to be a software engineer technically, although there are a lot of rigorous requirements generally to keep a job in software engineering for a long time, or you can find a software engineering job that won't necessarily prepare you for the next one. So it is possible to describe a role in society and reflect on the ways that other people interact with those goals, and also have conversations about what you can do to develop skills in those areas. Cheers. More money exists in the world than people are aware of, but the circulation with it is not that good because of loss aversion, which is just part of human psychology, often. We can also reflect on our relationship to the reasons why we exist with reason. I don't think all inertia is bad. Though, in terms of the reasons why development is encouraged or rewarded, pardon, the reasons why development is encouraged or rewarded should be evaluated. And also, that can't be the end of the consideration. I believe TikTok has a pretty decent structure when you go live. For one, what the requirements are and how you can learn those, how you can relate to the structure otherwise, and also how you can learn the rewards of doing so. I'm not trying to grow my account infinitely, and I have appreciated meeting people. Well, so far. For the most part, I reflect on how I relate to the reasons why I create and how it feels to need to do the things that I do in order to stabilize a career. If I want my brand to represent an honest attempt to develop intergenerational media literacy and also make that earnest effort accessible, how can I relate? How can I relate to the conversations that I've had? How can I reflect on them? And what do they mean? My major in college was learning and education studies with a concentration in applied learning science. The reason I bring that up in videos on TikTok is to describe that that's what I reflect on. What makes it easier for us to learn? What makes that more likely? And how can I measure what I'm learning? If it's possible for me to come up with a method and write it down and describe this, can I describe this publicly with other people and work on the same thing together with them? And the answer is yes. And it is possible to do this in a brand development context. And software engineering provides some roadmaps that abstract, well, some of the software engineering career development paths are abstractions of career development in general. And there are some pretty learnable career paths. Cheers. I like making art as an expression of the ways that I feel, and it is difficult to say that often. Years ago, when I was making videos optimistically, telling a story about how, despite challenges, I was feeling more optimistic about the future than I might have in the past, my father interrupted the videos that I was making. And that's been a trend with heckling and grabbing my phone and banging on the walls. And it's been disheartening because theoretically, I just need to tell the story well and then have that develop. Though there's an amount of skepticism with funding novel projects and what that means and how new development can work. Though fortunately, I believe the Olympics ceremony modeled in 2024. I believe the Olympics closing ceremony modeled a pattern for development that can align with societal growth. And effectively, my goals for development are what I can model and how I relate to other people who have similar goals for development. My major in college was learning and education studies with a concentration in applied learning science, and I dropped out of college. So, what I have to say is what you have to learn in school is more important than a degree. Though, also, I can communicate that having a degree can not incur some of the friction that not having a degree might. To say that a different way, in some spaces, friction will be added around degrees. Sometimes mentioning that you have a degree can concisely describe an amount of time that you theoretically spent focusing on a subject. If you've had experiences practicing telling stories about them and placing them into frames where you can revisit that you have described this before. That's what I can recommend. Not everyone will engage with every medium, so it might help to learn multiple media. Though you won't necessarily want to learn every medium, so it can be nice to network. It can be nice to meet other people who develop across media. And you can learn how to do this pretty well by working as a software engineer and just trying to remain employed for a career. Cheers. Ideally, I wouldn't have OCD, and the name of trauma doesn't feel as complex to me as some might make it out to be. I appreciate software engineering as a discipline because I've been able to practice developing language to identify the reasons why logic flows. And then what logic is means whatever. Because before and after spending 15 years reading and writing code, also trying to communicate logic within different social contexts, also navigating the reason why you spent so long studying engineering despite not being able to apply that. Do I need to say? Do I need to say? Why did I go to college if not to learn, only to be punished for not finishing? If my goal remains to continue when I can afford to, I understand humans aren't necessarily rational. My major in college was learning and education studies with a concentration in applied learning science. So if I'm motivated to learn or develop a brand that describes that I can learn, and I also have tools on social media to illustrate the process of practicing and developing fluency, responding to feedback in real time, and having conversations with people who I've practiced speaking to. Also, having conversations with people who I have not practiced speaking to. Sometimes it's easier to describe that I have been practicing and I also have been healing, and also it is necessary to describe those as distinct processes, and also I don't find that ideal either. Relationally, it has been challenging to allocate the time to reach the audiences who, I mean, like generationally, if we've spent years watching YouTube videos and it's boring to think about just being unemployed. And also, authenticity is valuable. And also, like, what is the reason that we're practicing these media? I tell the story of the reasons why I developed the factshift.com concept because that's what I can say about it. You can relate to software engineering the ways that you do and see how I have approached development. Currently, the branch that is deployed is the Netlify branch. That is the branch that is in production. The interface for factshift.com is meant to represent years of trying to reconcile that I was using a different word to mean, well, I was using the same word to mean different things when I described love and God with some important people in my life. Now I've had more conversations with literally thousands of people, and I've meditated a lot, and I've found ways to meditate and practice and develop and create. There are times that I felt uncertain about Christianity, and it was treated as a rejection, and I was rejected from very important developmental contexts. And that just hurt and was not reconciled. I'm not sure what would reconcile that. And I developed language with software development to share language with my father and was rejected from being able to apply those skills to an important context. I felt, logically, if the family was stressed about money, then it made sense to explore software engineering. While I was on the way to learning about electrical engineering, and I also wanted to share language with my father, and that is also the reason why I learned how to draw like cartoons. I had a developmental goal of being skilled enough for my father to accept my work in a relevant context, in a context that affirmed the reality that I was navigating on a day to day basis was something that he understood. And I kept working and working and working and burning out and returning home and not being able to describe what I was trying to do and why it was so important and what made me feel so joyful about the contexts where I found joy finally when I went to college. And there were a lot of meaningful people who I met in high school and also in extracurriculars. And also, it has been tremendously difficult to maintain the shape of relationship that we had when we were growing up. The structures that make it possible had, well, the structures that maintain the flow cost money. And engineering friends who remained in engineering have been able to afford it. Some of my transportation and communication structures have well, they've been abruptly disrupted, and that has been painful to navigate. Also, every relationship is different, so some of the client relationships were income streams that I guess theoretically would have been able to pay for the service that I, well, I don't want to get into it. People watch videos, and sometimes I wonder why. I make videos because I want to practice communicating with an audience who interprets this medium, or reflects on it, or can imagine making them themselves, can imagine making media this way. I also believe I can practice relating to a voice and seeing which parts of my website feel like something I would say. This can be a meditation on self, and practicing doing this in a brand context has been interesting. So, with my background in learning and education studies, and with a concentration in applied learning science, and the context of a 15-year career in software engineering, acknowledging some burnout and phases of intense effort to grow, I can describe that practicing your loop or your pitch or your reason for style is useful. And I've developed some tools to make it easier for you to turn your own story into toys that you want to play with and have those turn into useful assets for resumes and portfolios. Cheers. When you're looking for work as a software engineer, or even if you have a job as a software engineer, you'll hear people say things like, we shouldn't have lead code style interviews anymore. Lead code is a brand or a company or whatever. Like in that context, there's reference to the brand of lead code style. I mean, I guess I just kind of overthought referentiality. The point is, that's one way to approach asking someone if they have ever spent an amount of time studying data structures and algorithms deeply. I can say it's easier for me to make this kind of content when I've warmed up to making this kind of content. And when I can, then it's easier for me to describe a concept with a familiar audience. I can also make other videos when I feel less warmed up, and that is true with machines as well. And some people wonder if I'm AI, and perhaps I'll use these videos to train AI. And it isn't always frustrating, though when it is frustrating, sometimes I lose energy.